Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wastewater 101, the second webinar in a series of online activities and events about ocean sewage pollution. My name is Kristen Mays, and I'm the Reef Resilience Network Manager and your host for the webinar, which is brought to you by the Nature Conservancy with support from the Reef Resilience Network and NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program. During today's webinar, Chris Clapp of the Nature Conservancy will provide an introduction to the basics of wastewater, including an overview of terminology, how septic systems work and also fail, and how wastewater is managed, treated, and discharged into our oceans. Our presentation today will be followed by a discussion. Chris is a marine scientist for TNC's New York chapter and has led sewage mitigation efforts in Long Island for the past 11 years. As a reminder for folks who weren't able to join us on our first webinar in our series, the Reef Resilience Network is developing a body of resources for reef managers to address the threats of sewage. Resources will include web pages on the Reef Resilience Network Toolkit, case studies highlighting sewage monitoring and management strategies, and an online course to help managers build understanding on this topic and the many ways they can act. Throughout the webinar series, we'll be gathering information from you that we'll use to develop these resources. This is truly such a new field that we're relying on all of your experiences, tips, tools, and photos too, to help make these resources useful and compelling for reef managers. At the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey, and when we email out the webinar recording, we're going to provide some instructions for how to share photos if you happen to have sewage-related photos that you're willing to share for our use in the new sewage resources. A couple quick housekeeping items before I turn it over to Chris. Today's webinar will be 1 hour. As I mentioned, following the presentation, there will be a discussion session. There are 2 ways you can ask questions during the webinar. You can type your question into the question box at any time during the presentation or during the discussion session, or you can raise your hand during the discussion session and we can call on you. You can unmute your microphone and ask your question aloud yourself. And so you'll see that little hand icon next to your name that'll allow you to do that. If you're having any technical difficulties, such as trouble hearing or seeing the slides, you can send us a message via that same question box and we'll try to resolve the issue. We want to ask 2 questions of you before we get started as an opportunity to hear from you and get a sense of how wastewater is dealt with in your region. So you'll see a poll question shortly. Give you a few minutes to answer the question: what is the most common form of wastewater treatment in your geography? Okay, it looks like centralized treatment at a plant was the clear lead, winner by far. Great, and Chris, we'll let you speak to these results, and 6% do not know and 2% there is no treatment. Interesting. Okay, one more question. After your water is treated or not treated, where does it go? Just a couple are still coming in. Okay, and so I do not know is the winner here, which isn't too surprising, and the second runner up is directly to the ocean treated. Really interesting. Chris, I know you'll have a lot to say about these results, but thanks everyone for sharing. Let's see. Yeah, I think we can go ahead and get started. Chris, I'd love to pass it over to you to get the presentation going.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Chris, if you can turn on your camera too, that would be wonderful.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
I know.
There we go. Thank you for having me, and always happy to share what I've learned over the last decade or more regarding how wastewater impacts our environment. Those results were really, really interesting to me. Living in a highly densely populated place here in New York, of all places, a suburb of New York, an island nonetheless, with roughly 1.5 million people living in Suffolk County, which is the easternmost county of Long Island, if you're familiar with the region. 76% of households have on-site systems, and the majority of those are just cesspools. So it makes, take comfort that just outside one of the largest cities in the world, in one of the most affluent counties in the world, we still put our waste into a hole in the ground and hope for the best. So some of you are way further ahead technology-wise than we are here in that regards, in that, a lot of you have treatment, which is good to hear. So as noted, I will discuss some real basic terms, ranging from cesspools I had mentioned all the way up to sewage treatment facilities, some basic terminology, how these things are constructed, how they run, and sadly how they fail, and the impacts of those things. So, and a special thanks to Steph Weir for reaching out to me. This photo that you see here was at the Wakota-Hatchie Wetland Complex in Delray Beach, Florida, which recycles about 1 million gallons per day for recharge to their aquifer after it goes through a high-tech treatment facility. Pretty cool place where people go for their morning runs and take pictures and all that stuff. So kind of a place that made me realize what's possible if you invest in things appropriately. So, the first question is, why do we treat wastewater, right? So, the first reason why wastewater gets treated is to protect public health. Almost all engineers that work in the wastewater sector, their first charge is to protect public health. Some people may say that it is to enable development and to enable growth. But all the while, their first and foremost goal is to protect public health. A secondary goal of what they do is to protect and enhance ecologic health. And here in these pictures, as I said, I live and work primarily here on an island that is reliant upon its groundwater as its sole source of drinking water. So all of our discharge standards for groundwater are based on the US EPA's drinking water standard. And unfortunately, that standard is an order of magnitude less stringent than for environmental health. So while we might be doing a fairly good job at protecting public health, the environment is struggling. As you see a brown tide, harmful algal bloom, the brown tide above you, in the picture above, and a salt marsh calving like a glacier due to the roots systems being undermined by nutrient pollution. So, like I said, cesspools are basically a reinforced hole in the ground, which you could pump water from the ground, use it within your home, discharge it into the ground, and it goes away. Now, this was a fairly popular method of disposal, not treatment, disposal, in rural areas and here in places like Long Island and other parts of the Northeast that were glacial deposits because the sand was assumed to be a really good filter of pathogens. And while it might be good at filtering pathogens, all the other stuff that comes with wastewater more or less goes through that sandy soil unattenuated, or the nutrients and the pharmaceuticals and the personal care products don't get taken up by the microbes in the sand, or the lack of microbes in the sand. And I'll talk a lot about nitrogen. So a cesspool typically has a nitrate level or a total nitrogen level anywhere from 50 milligrams per liter all the way up to 150 milligrams per liter entering into the, or being discharged out of the bottom of that. Next up in the line is a conventional septic system. So in essence, what's happening here is the waste leaves your house, it enters a tank, and then it goes out for distribution after it leaves that tank. And the purpose of adding that tank in between is to trap solids, primarily for the purpose of trapping pathogens. Again, this is all public health driven. There's a little bit of nutrient retention within those tanks. And so the nitrates, or the total nitrogen level leaving the bottom of the leaching structure or the drain field. In most places, people use drain fields, they spread the waste out horizontally, shallower in the root zone. You get a little bit better attenuation of nutrients and other contaminants by using a leach field or a drain field. Now this works fairly well, as I said, for trapping solids and trapping fats, oils, and greases from going into the ground, and also trapping some pathogens. However, the implication is that it's maintained, right? So this is what a typical two-part septic tank looks like below the ground. So you have, you'd have the water coming in here from the left side of the screen. It drops down, and this section is big enough such that the water should stay within here, the waste should stay within here for about 2 days before it enters this smaller chamber and then goes out to the leaching structure. Now, what happens over time, if the system isn't inspected and or maintained properly, the solids begin to build up in the bottom, and you get a feedback here where the more solids build up, the less time the waste has to settle, so solids build up faster. Now that begins to fill up the bottom part of the tank, and at the top is your fat, oils, and greases, which rise to the top. And what could happen, and I've seen happen over time, is if this type of tank is not inspected and or pumped on an appropriate basis, those two levels can constrict the water, and literally what was a tank is now acting more or less as a pipe, and you're left with just a cesspool, and or it backs up into your house and you have a really bad mess and a big problem within the home. And so that gets us to failure. What does failure mean? So there's two types of failure. Hydraulic failure means that the soils can't take up any more water, that the pore spaces within the soils have accumulated so much organic matter that they can no longer take the water in, or the effluent of the waste in anymore, and then it either comes up to the surface or it backs up into the house. You can see this with cesspools. Often you'll see a big green ring on someone's property that might not otherwise have much for a lawn, and you know that they have a cesspool or hydraulic failure. Structural failures are much more serious, and sadly they do happen, and sadly people have been known to get hurt and or die in a structural failure, where you actually have a collapsing of the system and you have everything exposed to the surface. What you see here on the right is a hand-laid brick cesspool. Cesspools and septic systems can also fail due to sea level rise. So your system might be functioning. You might be able to flush your toilet. There might not be solids or fats built up anywhere, and the drain field might be able to drain. But what happens is if there's not enough separation between the bottom of that drain field and the groundwater, the soils can no longer serve the function of filtering out pathogens, and then you compromise the groundwater, which then ultimately leads to your surface water. So what happens, this is from a report to Miami-Dade County on what is going to happen or what is currently happening to a lot of their on-site systems. And so when a development might have been built long ago, the groundwater was down here. And now several decades have passed and we have sea level rise projections coming for the area. And a home at a certain elevation might have a completely compromised or fully failed system. It is now in contact with the groundwater. This person might still be able to flush their toilet, but they're putting raw sewage directly into the groundwater. A compromised system, as I mentioned, will not have adequate separation to remove those pathogens, and you're compromising the groundwater. And then a home at a slightly higher elevation will still have that separation, but its lifetime is shortened due to sea level rise. So now we'll talk about septic systems and their ability to reduce nitrogen loads. Some call these advanced septic systems. Where you have a septic tank coming out of the house where you collect the waste. That then goes to some sort of treatment unit, which may, through processes of aeration and then going back towards an unaerated compartment, be able to remove nitrogen from the system, and then it will go to a drain field. So we'll take a accepted standard of about 60 milligrams per liter of nitrogen coming out of a home, which will then go to a tank and reduce nitrogen loads by about 7% or so. The treatment unit could then get anywhere between 50 and 75% nitrogen removal, getting you down into the teens of nitrogen concentrations. That then goes to a drain field, which gets you an additional 35 to 50% nitrogen removal, with a grand total of 75 to 85% total reduction in nitrogen. And now, since that effluent coming out of that drain field is now stripped of so much of the solids, the nitrates, and the BOD, the biological oxygen demand, that's basically a number of how strong the wastewater is. So since that effluent now has less strength, the soils can do a better job of stripping the wastewater of some of the other contaminants like the pharmaceuticals, the personal care products, and other nutrients like phosphorus. So the cleaner the water is before it hits the soils, the more the microbes in the soils can do to reduce all of the other contaminants. Now, all of these systems, as well as most sewage treatment plants, rely upon natural biological processes or microbiological processes. You go to the bathroom, you have organic nitrogen, your proteins, your urea. They leave your home. They go into an area without oxygen, and they perform a process known as ammonification. They transform organic nitrogen to ammonium. Now, the next process would be to add aeration, and the microbes that live in the aeration compartment convert the ammonium to nitrate. And in most treatment facilities, this is nearly 100% complete, or even in most of those treatment units, this is nearly 100% complete process. Now, if you wanted to fully strip out all the nitrogen from the waste stream before it enters the environment or before it goes out for reuse, you need to send that nitrate-rich effluent back to an environment that has no oxygen and a carbon source, where it will perform the process of denitrification and release the nitrogen as nitrogen gas. Most sewage treatment plants and most on-site sewage treatment systems are limited by the amount of carbon in the waste stream to perform this function, so some add carbon during their processes. So now we'll get a little bit further down the line and think about what are the components of a typical sewage treatment system. So you have your area, your collection area, and that might be a business district, it might be homes, it might have some commercial properties. So that water gets from the home, goes into a small lateral line for collection. So there's a lateral coming out of each home or business. Typically, those are privately owned and on private property. Then it goes into a conveyance system where it gets collected, and then those pipes go into bigger pipes known as mains. And some of these mains can be pretty large. If you're fully relying on gravity, they go deeper and deeper into the ground, and sometimes sometimes need to be raised back up to rely on gravity again, in which case they'll have a pumping station and then go use gravity once again. Then it goes to the treatment facility where the water or the wastewater gets separated from the sludge and whatever solids are in it, and the effluent then gets treated through the processes I've mentioned above, and then that eventually either gets discharged to the ground or to your receiving water body. So what happens in that treatment process, right? So for one thing, the water, as I mentioned, the water, a lot of these sewage treatment plants rely upon gravity to get to the treatment facility. So then they have to lift up all of that sewage so that then it could then flow by gravity from one compartment to the next. The first thing is to pull out lots of solids. There's all sorts of things that end up in the sewage collection system. I've heard of everything from sweatshirts to car tires showing up at our sewage collection system. So they need to sieve out and collect a lot of the garbage and sludge that comes out. That then goes into those settling compartments that I mentioned, where they have ammonification happening. So the solids begin to settle to the bottom. And over time, as it goes from one baffle to the next, it gets clearer and clearer. And then the effluent then goes into aeration compartments or bioreactors, where you have aeration and you have that process of nitrification, breaking down the ammonium into nitrate. That then would then go into a final secondary set of clarifiers that where they have these rotors that move really slowly to keep the water mixed, but they are careful not to add oxygen into that environment to create the process of denitrification. Some plants at this point could have close to drinkable water. However, the pathogens and such are still in there at this point. And this cartoon here shows a final stage of treatment where they're adding chlorine to disinfect the clarified water or effluent. And a lot of plants now have switched from chlorine disinfectant to UV disinfectant, as the process is less impactful on the receiving waters. And in the long term, is a more cost-effective process, so long as you have good treatment ahead of time. So there's two different types of sewer systems. You have a combined sewer system and a separate sewer system. So on the top, you will see a separate sewer system. And what this means is that the sewage, wastewater from people and buildings and homes and businesses. That is separate from the water collected from stormwater drains and the roadways and people's downspouts and such. And so in this upper cartoon, you have a separate flow of wastewater and stormwater, and only the wastewater goes to the sewage treatment plant, and only the stormwater goes to the surface water bodies via the stormwater collection system. On the bottom, you have a combined sewer system where the two systems are inherently combined. And this is pretty common in some older cities. A lot of the East Coast of the United States have combined sewer systems. And it made sense at the time because the streets were pretty dirty, especially when you still had horses being used on the streets. You have a lot of garbage being collected from the streets, oil, other residues. You really don't want stormwater flowing directly into your surface waters. So it actually made sense to have combined sewers in some of these densely populated, basically fully impervious areas. But what happens when it rains in a combined sewer system is the flow gets to such a point that the receiving treatment facility can't handle all of the flow, and they build in these little weirs at the ends of their drain pipes such that when that flow reaches the point where it could go over that weir, you get a direct combined sewer overflow discharge to your surface water, and now you have raw sewage entering your surface waters. So here's an aerial photo of a treatment facility, which I've had the pleasure of getting to know fairly well. It treats the effluent or the sewage of about 500,000 residents in Nassau County, which is the westernmost county on Long Island, closer to New York City. It had been a challenge to the community for a couple of decades. Lots of complaints about its performance, and nobody had the budgets to do anything really about it. So it was kind of pushed, everything kept getting pushed off with this facility. It was completely inundated during Superstorm Sandy. And even to this day, there's certain parts of it that still rely on backup generators to function. But it's come a long way in the last 9 years or so. And they've actually been able to restructure an existing facility in such a way that they took 4 of these settling tanks and actually transformed those settling tanks into tertiary treatment tanks, which remove the nitrogen from the system. So this sewage treatment plant now puts out 50% less nitrogen than it did just several years ago. And there's little to no complaints from the surrounding property owners about odors. It's come a long way in the last several years. And in fact, they've even gotten the waste to become so clean that they're reusing some of the clarified and disinfected effluent within the treatment facility to clean things that they otherwise would have pumped in millions of gallons of potable water per week, I believe, to just perform cleaning functions. So there are opportunities with a lot of smart engineering and a lot of better oversight to take something that was completely dilapidated and failing and turn it into something that's more or less a model for what we should be doing. The final step for this treatment plant is it discharges into this tiny little channel behind a barrier island back here. And it would discharge about 65 million gallons per day of partially treated sewage, which is now 50% cleaner than it used to be. The final stage for this is to utilize an existing aqueduct under a highway to run it to another treatment facility for additional treatment, and then 3 miles offshore into the ocean. So this bay will become 99% cleaner in a couple of years than it has been. before, saving a lot of these salt marshes and other communities around this area. So how do sewers fail? Now, I know there's a lot of people from around the world, and I apologize if I just ruined your lunch, but sewers typically fail because people did something wrong. So fats, oils, and greases, as you see in this upper right picture here, that's a lateral pipe completely clogged with just fat, oil, and grease, is really, really bad for sewage treatment systems. It's bad for on-site systems. You should never let yourselves, your friends know, never put fats, oils, and greases down the drain. Wipe them out in the garbage as opposed to letting them go down the drain. There is no such thing as a flushable wipe. I don't, I had to black out the brand on here, but there's many, many different brands that sell flushable wipes, either baby wipes or adult wipes or just wipes in general. They're not flushable. This picture here on the left is what happens when you get several thousand gallons per day of flushable wipes going into a pump, and then that pump fails and backs up the system. Other less common ways that sewers fail is they get overwhelmed with water, or you have a failure where the concrete of the pipes fails and falls apart. Now, I mentioned the sanitary sewer overflow. The combined sewer overflow is when you have storm water and wastewater mixed, and it has an overflow directly into a surface water body. A sanitary sewer overflow only occurs in a separate sewer system. And this happens when you have things like wipes and fats, oils, and greases blocking up the system. The final failure for sewage treatment plants is infiltration and inflow. Infiltration and inflow basically means water getting into the system that doesn't belong there, right? So on the right-hand side of the screen, you have a properly connected home to a sewer system, right? So there are downspouts. Actually, most homes have to manage their downspouts on their own property around here, but in this picture, the downspout is allowed to go to the stormwater drain. Your street drains go directly into their own stormwater system, and the sewage treatment, the sewer lateral comes out of the home and enters into the sewer main in the street. Now, what can happen over time is that a homeowner might have flooding on their property when it rains, so they hook their downspout into the sewer lateral. Trees often grow through roots depending on what the pipes are made of. We have a lot of clay pipes and what's called Orangeburg pipes here on Long Island from when steel was not available during World War II, and just broken pipes and cracked pipes in general. Sometimes municipalities, the DPW people will be lazy and hook the stormwater drain into the first pipe they see as opposed to running it to where they should go. And the most common way for water getting into a sewage treatment system and overwhelming it when it rains is manhole covers and just deterioration of the pipes in general. And what that looks like in practice, here's a meter upstream and downstream of where a remediation and inflow took place. So the blue line is downstream, and you have all of this water coming in here. 5 inches of water a year coming into this system, or at a time. And they fixed the system, and then the flow became much less. They still get peaks when it rains, but for the most part, the system is receiving and handling much less water than it had before. And as an example of this, the treatment facility I showed to you before, the collection system for that treatment facility is in really good shape and returns back to normal flow within a day or two after a heavy rainfall event. In contrast to that, a treatment facility just to the east of it took a whole week to return back to normal flow level after we had about a 12-inch rain event a couple of weeks ago. And that's because the groundwater is so high and water just kept coming into the system. And so treating rainwater is not an efficient use of a sewage treatment plant. And then in dry times, water goes both ways, right? So if you, particularly if you have a force main, or if the water going through the pipe is under pressure, you could get sewage leaking out of those mains, and that's called exfiltration. So infiltration is when you have high groundwater and the groundwater exerts pressure on the pipes, the water comes into it. And when those pipes are dry and under pressure, you can get sewage leaking out of the pipes into the groundwater. And I discussed a lot of different things here, but don't let a sewage treatment plant be your goal. Don't let on-site systems be your goal. There's an approach to finding the right solution for every situation, and let clean water and healthy oceans be the goal. And ultimately your path to finding those solutions will rely on what your nitrogen reductions are. You could have on-site systems, you could have a clustered systems where just a few houses share a system. A satellite system is where you have a small sewage treatment plant and water is collected from a neighborhood and sent to one facility. And then you could have a large centralized sewer system. That has to be balanced with the physical environment. How much loading, or what's the pathogen or the pollutant of concern you want to reduce per unit area? The residence time, so what's the impact to the receiving water that the sewage is going to? For us, depth to groundwater is a really big deal. We have water beneath our feet, quite literally. Your soil types, and what type of density you're looking to capture. And every scenario should consider sea level rise. As I said, a lot of these big sewage treatment plants are put intentionally close to the coast because they rely on gravity. That might not be the best solution moving forward. And then you have to balance all of this with costs. How much is the cost, and what's the workforce required to do operations and maintenance? And that will give you a number of what's your best bang for the buck of cost per pound of removal of whatever your pollutant of concern is. I would never have imagined 6-7 years ago that these on-site systems would be more cost effective than a sewage treatment facility. That the conventional knowledge was that they weren't, but the costs lately are showing that it's 5 to 6 times cheaper to upgrade and to clean up our waters with on-site systems than it is to try and build new sewage treatment facilities. Not to mention we just don't have the land or capital costs to do so. So with that, I'll leave you a picture of a created wetland that we had built at our offices in Cold Spring Harbor. This little wetland here receives about 700 gallons per day of sewage. And our goal was to get as close to zero pollution discharge from this as possible. And the bees and butterflies absolutely love it. So with that, happy to open up the discussion.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. That was really interesting. Some of those photos were a little frightening, but that's the reality of the issue we're talking about. But that presentation was just a very useful primer for us non-sewage literate folks. So big thank you. I'd now, as Chris said, like to open up the webinar for discussion and questions. Remember, you can either send us your question or comment via the question box, or raise your hand and we will call on you to ask your question yourself. In addition to questions, we welcome sharing about any challenges or examples you have or know of sewage monitoring and management actions. And the idea is so that we can learn from each other and get ideas for the new resources we're developing. Stephanie Weir is joining our discussion. Steph is TNC Senior Scientist, and for those of you who missed our kickoff webinar in the series, she was the presenter for that. So thanks for joining us, Steph, and thank you so much, Chris, for the presentation. A couple questions came in. Let's start with a manager in Indonesia. Chris, this sounds like it's directed towards you. Exactly how long should the distance be between the septic tank and the well water? Do you think that if the wastewater system in houses had the septic tank and the well close enough, this would lead to a condition which the water from the well will be affected or polluted?
That's a yes. It will contaminate your well. A lot has to do with soil type, right? So here, where we have literally just silica sand as our soil medium, our regulations are 100 feet between the discharge point and a well. People have been known to get variances for 65 feet or 20 meters. And we have seen instances where in one particular community that is highly reliant upon wells and cesspools, where one neighbor upgraded their sanitary system and the next neighbor down gradient of them, the next time they had their well tested, their nitrate levels were much lower. So it happens quickly. And yes, there's it easily either for nitrates, other contaminants, and pathogens. If it's too close, you end up drinking your neighbor's effluent or your own.
Doesn't sound good. Okay, next question. How might we be able to tell if rising sea levels are affecting a coastal septic system?
You'd have to know. So there's some basics. So if the 11-foot elevation mark is a pretty good marker, or 5 to 11-foot elevation, you could basically assume that anything that's underground is getting compromised. So we had historically been highly reliant on these deeper leaching structures. They're basically cesspools even after a septic tank. And in many cases, they are at a minimum of 6 to 8 feet deep. So if you were deeper than that, you were probably already compromised. What happens now in a lot of coastal structures is they'll build a big berm up around the building or a bulkhead around the building to get more sand in to get a greater separation. But if ground level above the discharge structure is less than 5 feet, you could probably assume, you don't have more than a couple of feet below you between you and the wastewater and the groundwater. Does that make sense?
Steph, you look like you want to say something.
Steph wants to jump in.
Oh, I don't want to correct you. I'm trying to understand it, actually. So sorry, I give myself away.
If you're at 5 feet and your leaching structure is 3 feet big, and you have a foot of soil between you and the top of the leaching structure, the bottom of that leaching structure is 4 feet down. So you don't have adequate separation between there and the groundwater to treat for pathogens at a minimum.
I guess my question is, when you say you're at 5 feet, does that mean you're 5 feet above sea level? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah,
you're talking about sea
that's
level?
correct. If you're at 5 foot elevation, and it all depends. It depends on how thick that leaching structure is.
Gotcha. Thanks.
I'm sorry if that was more confusing than helpful.
No, it was good. I just got confused about if you were at 5 feet or I'm thinking about my real world situation and trying to link it up. So that's really helpful. Yeah. Thank you.
While we're on this topic, a manager from the Caribbean who says they have little elevation above sea level is asking, are there benefits to composting toilets?
There are if you have the people to maintain them. Where we have a composting toilet at one of the visitor centers, and it's everyone's dreaded day when they have to go in there once a year and take care of the thing. So there's certainly, there's a lot of things I didn't get to go over here, like urine collection, holding tanks, low pressure systems. There's a whole bunch of other options out there, and composting toilets being one of them. If managed appropriately, there's certainly benefits to them.
One of the things that we're going to be doing and offering to folks through the Reef Resilience curriculum and just other resources that we're putting together are overviews of a range of different technology types, and as well as examples of where they're being used, where we can find them. So that's always our challenge. But we'll be able to talk about that. We'll be sharing pros and cons of those different technologies, because as Chris has said, like, just at the end of your talk, don't think that on-site treatment is the solution for you, or that you must have a centralized sewer system. Those are both viable options depending on where you are and the governance and all kinds of different things. But there are lots of different solutions, and they're growing every day, right? And so Chris is going to be talking about exactly more specifically about what they are doing to improve water quality in Long Island in our next webinar. So we'll get to hear more specifics about a particular system.
Thanks, Steph. Next question, are small-scale created wetlands like the one you pictured practical in certain climates for single-home residential purposes?
They could be. Yeah, that, to my knowledge, that one that I showed you is one of the smallest ones I've ever seen. Most created wetland systems are usually serve whole communities. And they're getting there. They take a bit of oversight and tinkering to get really functioning well, or at least that was my experience. But yeah, that's certainly an option that a lot of people are looking into, because they want a feature that works for them, right? So if it could fit into the landscape, then they're happy with it. They definitely take up a little bit of a footprint more than, say just dropping a town, but they are an option if you have the space to do so. They do take up a little bit more space.
Steph, did you want to chime in on that one?
Sorry, no, I mean, I think I'm just a big fan of constructed wetlands in general, because of the multiple benefits they provide. They don't just treat, you'll see, I talked about this a bit in the last webinar. They don't just treat the water, they provide habitat and other services and other benefits. So if you have some space to do it, it's something to consider. I mean, Chris and I visited a massive one. I was really surprised at the population it was serving. But my first job at the Nature Conservancy in the Caribbean, we had a small one just for our office, and it worked as a showcase. We were trying to encourage it. That was almost 20 years ago, in the community as a good option. So it's always good. This is one of those opportunities where I get excited about the solutions, because they solve other problems besides just reducing pollution or treating water. You can, Chris talked about this with fertilizer, being able to get fertilizer from the waste, or water that can be used for drinking water even, or fuel. So there's these other solutions that come depending on the technology that you use, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I believe there's a treatment facility in Arizona that not only do they try and reuse a lot of the water, but then the enriched or the nutrient enriched water then goes through a plant where they grow algae for fuel. And it's just this great closed loop system where you're utilizing, the further we could get away from thinking of water as a single stream use item, the better. And the more we could close that loop on managing and understanding the water cycle as one, will bring much greater returns on our infrastructure investments.
I see a hand up. Stuart, would you like to ask your question aloud? I'll go ahead and unmute you, and please speak up and share your question or comment if you'd like
Great.
to.
Chris, thanks for your presentation today.
My pleasure.
Yeah, we enjoyed it. And you might be getting into this in the next presentation, but we are trying to move forward with some nitrogen reducing biofilters like they've done in Suffolk County. And one of the questions we have is, how much it seems like it's going to require, more space, but it seems like a really effective way to reduce nitrogen. So just wanted to get you to answer that, and then just let you know we installed our first incinerating toilet today in Hawaii. So kind of a cool thing that's completely waterless.
Yes. So what's Stuart referred to there is kind of an old technology come back into fashion again. The concept of a nitrogen reducing biofilter, and it's really simple and really, really effective. And basically all it is you have a septic tank to separate out all of the solids and a pump, and the pump disperses the effluent over a broad area. And then that effluent trickles down through a layer of sand, and the sand nitrifies the ammonia, right? And so now you have nitrate coming through the sand, and then it hits a layer underneath that of sand mixed with sawdust. And that provides the carbon and slows down the effluent to a point that it goes anoxic and creates a denitrifying layer right there. So just in the space that you would normally have a drain field, it's a little bit bigger, you have full treatment just with one pump in that drain field. And yeah, they're really great. I believe for like your typical 4-bedroom home, it's a little less than 800 square feet. I can't do the math to meet. I apologize for everybody out there. I know I'm probably the only one talking in US units. But yeah, great option, Stuart. I'm glad to hear you guys are doing that.
Thank you.
Okay, what are the emerging pollutants of concern with regards to wastewater discharge to the ocean and impact on reef resilience? So, emerging pollutants of concern. Who wants to take this one?
I'll let Steph finish, but the general category of pollutants of emerging concern are your pharmaceuticals, your personal care products, PFAS, PFOA. It's in almost everything that's a manufacturing solvent, and 1,4-dioxane. Those are like kind of the big things. So it's pharmaceuticals and personal care products is a wide range of things, but the PFAS and the 1,4-dioxane are a little bit more challenging because traditional wastewater treatment systems don't filter them out. And they're really difficult to filter out on the drinking water side. Their impacts on reef resilience, I'll let Steph answer that, but I know a lot of these, like that NRB that Stuart just mentioned, they're like 99% effective at pharmaceutical and personal care products. So there's ways of treating them, but I'll let Steph finish.
Yeah, so I think those are the right ones to mention in terms of I think a lot about pharmaceuticals because this is also very much tied to public health, right? Because if it's making its way back into drinking water, you could be consuming small doses of somebody's chemotherapy drugs, their antidepressants, their hormone replacement therapy. There's all kinds of disturbing things to think about that you're consuming that you don't realize you are, that can have an impact on your own health. So I've actually been following the literature on that a bit, and there's more and more on the impacts of different types of pharmaceuticals on marine organisms. Some of them are tropical, like coral reefs and associated habitats, and I'm also just recently looking at some studies in temperate environments where they're looking at the impacts of antibiotics, painkillers, things that you don't really think of too much, but they're actually having real impacts on the growth of organisms, how they grow, the morphology or shape of an organism, their reproductive capabilities, whether they can reproduce at all, like it might affect their gonad development, or their fitness. So they're just not being they're just sort of diminished in their ability to reproduce. So pharmaceuticals are certainly a big area. The other thing that's sort of, there's not as good evidence as I would like to see at this point, but there's some good preliminary evidence around the effects of antibiotics on the coral microbiome, so that we're learning more and more about the role of the coral microbiome. So that sort of mucousy layer that sits over top of coral colonies is chock full of all kinds of microbes that they're learning play a protective role. And when those microbes get disrupted, just like in your own system, when you take antibiotics and it ends up giving you digestive discomfort or, whatever, all kinds of things can happen when you take antibiotics. Can have, we're all living organisms. It makes sense that if you're exposed, you can have similar negative impacts to the microbial community. So those microbial communities can protect corals from disease. They also have the potential to connect just to increase their resilience in general. So we know that a more immune compromised coral is more likely to bleach. So these, there's all these things out there. We often think mostly about nitrogen and phosphorus, which are really important and have dramatic effects. There are other things that corals are getting exposed to, and other marine organisms are getting exposed to with sewage pollution.
Do you want to mention sunscreens, benzoline, and
what I would say about that, Chris? I don't know. We've never talked about that topic, but it's interesting because there's been a lot in the news about coral reef safe sunscreens, but I've been looking at the sources, and pretty reputable sources are saying that it's not as big of a concern for corals, and it's actually giving people a false sense of doing something good for oceans by wearing coral safe sunscreens. I would still encourage people to use coral safe sunscreens because they're people safe sunscreens. The problems that they're pointing out in the sunscreens are chemicals that are endocrine disruptors that affect people. And so you shouldn't be absorbing them through your skin. I actually ran a symposium at the last International Coral Reef Symposium in Hawaii with a toxicologist. And one of the things he shared was that when you put these sunscreens on your skin, you pee them out within 20 minutes. They go into your system, through your system, and into the toilet within 20 to 30 minutes. So you start appreciating that. And so I just encourage people, go ahead and avoid those nasty sunscreens, but they haven't been able to demonstrate really very well the impacts on corals.
Thank you to you both. I'm sorry to have to wrap up the discussion session, but we are nearing the top of the hour, and I just want to be mindful of everyone's time. There are a number of really great questions here and comments, so we do encourage everyone on the webinar to continue the conversation on the Reef Resilience Network's online discussion platform, the Network Forum. This is an interactive community of coral reef managers and practitioners from around the world. So you can go to reefresilience.org, click on the network tab, and then there you can enter the forum or sign up to join it. And you'll see we've put a post for today's Wastewater 101 webinar, and we'll be sharing a recording of the webinar there, along with links to additional resources that Chris has shared with us. So please go there for those resources, and then feel free to post your question. If you have a burning question that we didn't have a chance to address, please share it there. And please also, just in the interest of sharing and exchange, please feel free to share any ideas for resources that you think we should include as we're building out this Ocean Sewage Online Toolkit. Or if you have any resource requests, please share those there. As soon as we end the webinar, you'll see a short survey. Please share your feedback on the webinar, share feedback on what you want to learn specifically around this topic next, and if you have any ideas for case studies or resources. We'll also be emailing out a link to the recording of this presentation, as well as some instructions for how to share sewage-related photos. So we're looking for any sewage-related photos that you have that you're willing to share that we could include in our new resources. Always on a photo hunt. And as Steph mentioned, our next webinar in this series is the Long Island sewage story. We'll get to hear from Chris again, as well as from his colleague, Stuart Lowry, and that'll be the end of October, October 27th. And Chris and Stuart will tell the story or the tale of a 10-year effort to tackle the daunting nitrogen pollution issue on Long Island. And they'll really take some time to describe their ongoing recipe for impactful, enduring conservation. And this is long, but I'm going to say it because I think it's really important. Includes good science, adaptive strategies, technological innovation, social science to shift behavior norms, policy initiatives at local, state, and federal levels, new funding streams, and partnerships of all kinds. Really easy recipe.
Yeah.
So Chris and Stuart will share some insights that they've learned through that 10-year process, as well as a few pitfalls and challenges they've encountered along the way. So we hope you can join us, and thank you for participating in this webinar, and big thanks to our speaker, Chris. Chris, we really appreciate you sharing your expertise on wastewater, and Stephanie, glad you join us.
I wish I didn't have to talk about this, but I'm happy to talk about it.
Well, we thank you. Stephanie, closing words?
All I want to say is how much I appreciate hearing from you, Chris. And I learned some new things today. I mean, I've been learning about this for years now, and I always learn something new. And I really want to encourage folks to tune in to what Chris and Stuart are going to be sharing at our next webinar, because it's really getting into the how. And I think there's a lot of it's interesting. Long Island is obviously not a place with coral reefs, but they are an island, and they are a community that is very similar in many ways to the places that we work and live in the tropics. And the solutions are actually very relevant as well. So they're not, the solutions Chris and Stuart are going to describe are not solutions that you go, oh, that's just something they're doing in the US up in the temperate zone. No, these are solutions that can be used. And as Stuart Coleman piped in, they're looking at using in Hawaii. So we look forward to you joining that. And we'll probably go, that's what Kristen talked about was a lot. We're probably going to dissect this more and spend a little more time with Chris and Stuart over the series of the webinar to learn about different aspects of their work that were really interesting that we can learn from. So thank you. Shut up.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris and Stephanie. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us today. See you on the 27th.